The fall of a queen. In the heart of the galaxy, beyond the reach of most star maps, lay the Thornback Nebula, an awe-inspiring region of space where stars were born in bursts of fiery brilliance. At the center of this vast expanse was a figure so revered, so respected, that her name was known across every corner of the galaxy: Queen Alyssa. Her people adored her, her allies praised her, and even those from distant star systems looked to her as a beacon of wisdom and justice. Her appearance alone commanded respect. Her skin, a stunning shade of liquid silver, shimmered with the light of 1,000 stars. Her violet eyes, intense, piercing, yet warm, seemed to hold the wisdom of countless generations. When Alyssa walked among her people, there was an unmistakable grace, an energy that radiated authority without the need for words. She was both the ruler and protector, a living symbol of peace and strength that had united fractured worlds and brought prosperity to the stars. But nothing in the galaxy could prepare her people for what would come next. A strange illness, one unlike anything seen before, began to spread throughout the royal bloodline. At first, it seemed a minor inconvenience, a temporary ailment that Alyssa would surely overcome. But as the weeks turned into months, her condition deteriorated in ways that defied logic and understanding. Her once flawless skin began to darken, as if a shadow was slowly creeping across her very being. It cracked and fissured, becoming brittle and fragile. Her majestic violet eyes lost their brightness, sinking deep into their sockets, the vibrant hue fading into a dull, lifeless gray. The queen, the beacon of hope and unity, had been transformed into something grotesque. The disease spread through her body, attacking not just her appearance, but her very essence. It sapped her strength, leaving her unable to perform even the simplest of tasks. The once graceful movements became slow and laborious. Her regal presence, once enough to command the loyalty of entire systems, was now met with whispers and fearful glances. What was once revered was now avoided, and those who had sworn an oath of allegiance to her now feared her presence. As the weeks stretched into months, the support she had once enjoyed crumbled. Her closest advisors, her most trusted allies, began to withdraw. Ministers resigned in fear, their loyalty replaced by disgust. Even her most devoted healers, who had once been at her side through every challenge, refused to step foot into her chambers. The palace, once a hive of activity, now stood silent and empty. The halls of her grand residence on Kreela, filled with marble pillars and golden tapestries, felt like a prison, an ornate cage from which there was no escape. Alyssa's heart broke as she realized the terrible truth. Her people, the ones who had once revered her, had abandoned her. She was no longer the queen they had adored. The disease had not only ravaged her body, it had made her a pariah, an outcast, someone to be feared and forgotten. She had always been a symbol of hope and strength, but now she was a broken shell of the leader she once was. And yet, even in the face of such devastating isolation, Alyssa refused to give up. Her sense of duty to her people, her unyielding desire to protect them, still burned brightly within her chest. She knew that if she was to die, it would not be from the disease alone. It would be from the neglect of those who had sworn their loyalty to her. Her body may have failed her, but her will, her determination, remained unbroken. In the stillness of her palace, she managed to gather what little strength she had left and sent out a final desperate call. With trembling hands, she activated a distress signal that would echo across the galaxy. "This is Queen Alyssa of the Thornback Nebula." Her voice crackled over the comm, weak but filled with an unmistakable resolve. "I am afflicted with an illness beyond the understanding of my people. To those who hear this, I implore you, send aid. Do not let my story end in silence. Do not let me be forgotten." Her words, full of despair yet unwavering, spread across the stars, reaching countless ears. Some dismissed the plea outright, uninterested in helping a fallen queen. Others, more cautious, speculated that her condition was beyond help, that she had become a lost cause, and some simply turned a blind eye, unwilling to face the grim reality that awaited anyone who dared to intervene. Yet, amid the indifference and neglect, one voice in the vastness of space would answer the call, a voice driven not by political gain or strategic advantage, but by a deep sense of humanity and compassion. Far across the galaxy, aboard a humanitarian ship called the Aurora Lance, Dr. Eli Ramsey, one of the finest medics in the Galactic Humanitarian Corps, listened to the distress call. He had seen it all: plagues, outbreaks, and the aftermath of war, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The Queen's voice, frail yet filled with unyielding courage, struck something deep within him. There was something different about this call, something that tugged at his heart, urging him to act. "Are you seriously considering this?" asked his assistant, LC, a highly advanced AI that had seen its fair share of distress calls. The voice of LC, cold and logical, was filled with skepticism. "There are a dozen other cases you could respond to. This one, it's highly unusual. I can't ignore it," Eli replied, his gaze fixed on the flickering message. "She's a queen, for crying out loud. If no one else is going to help her, I have to try." LC hesitated, then spoke again, this time with a note of concern. "You know the rumors. Her condition has turned her into a pariah. This could be political, not medical. If you step in, you'll be walking into a firestorm." Eli ran a hand through his dark hair, deep in thought. The stakes were high, that much was certain. But he wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially one that seemed so steeped in injustice. If there was even a chance to help her, he had to try. "I didn't sign up for this job to take the easy cases," he said, determination hardening in his voice. "Set course for Krayla. Let's see if we can make a difference." And so, the Aurora Lance set its course for Krayla, where a fallen queen waited in isolation, her fate hanging by a thread. The journey was long, but Eli's mind was already racing with the possibilities of what he might face. The galaxy had abandoned her, but he would not. The people of the Thornback Nebula had turned their backs on their queen, but he, a simple human medic, would not. The next chapter of Alyssa's story was about to unfold, a courageous decision. The Aurora Lance glided through the vast emptiness of space, the stars around it nothing more than distant points of light in the endless void. Inside the ship, Eli Ramsey paced back and forth, his thoughts as turbulent as the space outside. The decision to answer Queen Alyssa's distress signal had not been made lightly. Even now, as the sleek ship made its way toward Krayla, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a storm, one far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. His assistant, LC, was unusually quiet, her usual sarcastic remarks replaced by an air of cautious neutrality. Eli could sense that she was still processing the gravity of the situation, just as he was. She had her reservations, and who could blame her? To intervene in the life of a queen, especially one who had been abandoned by her own people, was fraught with risk. What had happened to Alyssa was a puzzle, and even the most experienced medics in the galaxy couldn't figure out the cause of her affliction. Was it truly a disease, or something more sinister? Was it the result of natural causes, or had someone sought to destroy the once mighty ruler? The unknowns were endless, and Eli's mind raced with the possibilities. But one thing was clear: he couldn't turn away. As the Aurora Lance neared Krayla, Eli stood before the ship's navigational console, staring at the glowing blue hologram of the planet. Krayla was a jewel of the galaxy, a planet with sweeping oceans, towering mountains, and sprawling cities that glittered like gemstones. But as the ship descended into Krayla's atmosphere, Eli saw none of its usual majesty. The capital city, once vibrant with life and bustling with trade, looked eerily quiet. It was as if the very soul of the planet had been drained away, leaving only a shell of its former glory. The tension in Eli's chest tightened as the ship descended into the shadow of the planet's towering spires. The palace, where Queen Alyssa once held court, loomed before him, an architectural marvel that stood tall against the sky, its golden towers glinting in the fading light. Yet despite its grandeur, there was a haunting emptiness about it. The streets below were silent, the air still. The city felt abandoned, its heart hollowed out by the Queen's illness and the abandonment of her people. As the Aurora Lance touched down on the palace grounds, Eli's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was it. There was no turning back now. He was stepping into the unknown, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him like a heavy mantle. A small contingent of palace guards awaited him as he exited the ship. Their faces were unreadable, their expressions a mix of skepticism and wariness. Eli could see the way they avoided his gaze, as if ashamed to be standing there at all. These guards, once proud to serve their queen, had now become reluctant participants in a tragedy they had no power to stop. One of them, a tall figure with a grim expression, approached Eli. "You're the medic," he said flatly, his voice lacking any trace of respect. Eli nodded. "That's right. Take me to her." The guard exchanged a quick glance with his comrades, then motioned for Eli to follow. As they made their way through the palace, Eli couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing in on him. The halls, once filled with laughter, conversation, and the sounds of a thriving monarchy, were now dead silent. The marble floors were slick with dust, and the golden tapestries that lined the walls had faded with age, their once vibrant colors now muted by time and neglect. Eli's thoughts turned to Alyssa. What had happened to the woman he had heard about in the transmission? What had turned her from the radiant queen of legend into the broken figure now feared and rejected by her own people? He didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. She needed help. More than that, she needed someone who believed in her, even if no one else did. As they reached the entrance to her chambers, the guards hesitated. The tall one from earlier cleared his throat and spoke in a low voice, almost as if confessing. "No one's been inside in weeks," he said quietly. We couldn't bear it. The sight of her, it's too much." Eli's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He couldn't afford to be swayed by fear. He was here to help, and that was all that mattered. Without a word, Eli pushed past the guards and entered the Queen's chambers. The door creaked open, and a sharp metallic scent filled the air. An overwhelming, almost suffocating odor that made Eli's throat tighten. The room was dimly lit, the once grand furnishings now covered in dust and decay. But it wasn't the condition of the room that caught Eli's attention. It was the figure lying motionless in the center of the room. Queen Alyssa. She was no longer the magnificent ruler who had once stood tall in the face of countless challenges. Her skin, once radiant and silver, was now a patchwork of dark, cracked patches like scorched earth. Her body was thin and frail, a mere shadow of the queen she had been. Her face, once full of life and warmth, was now gaunt, her eyes dull and sunken. A cold emptiness surrounded her, and it was clear that she had not moved for a long time. Eli felt a pang of sympathy as he approached her, but he quickly squashed it down. Sympathy wouldn't help her. Only action would. He had to be professional, focused. He had to treat her like any other patient, even if the situation was unlike anything he had ever faced. He crouched beside her and began to examine her, his hands gentle but precise. Her body was ice-cold to the touch, and Eli could feel the heavy weight of the disease coursing through her veins. It wasn't just her appearance that had changed. This illness, whatever it was, had affected her on a molecular level. It was as though her very cells were slowly being eaten away from the inside out. But despite her condition, there was still a faint pulse beneath her frail skin. "Queen Alyssa," he murmured, his voice soft but firm. "I'm here to help you." There was no response. The silence in the room was almost deafening. For a moment, Eli sat back on his heels, lost in thought. How had this happened? Why had no one come to her aid? What had turned this vibrant queen into a pariah? He didn't know, but he was determined to find out. He wasn't here to judge. He was here to save a life. With a deep breath, Eli activated his medical equipment, setting to work. The fight for Alyssa's life was just beginning. The hidden truths. As Eli continued his work, the stillness of the room weighed heavily on him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of his medical equipment as it scanned Alyssa's frail form. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. Her pulse was weak, a faint rhythm that seemed to come and go like a whisper in the wind. It was clear she was on the brink of death. And yet, the strength of her spirit, despite the devastating changes to her body, was undeniable. The Queen was still holding on, but for how much longer? Eli's hands moved with precision, applying various tools and instruments as his mind raced. He had seen countless injuries, diseases, and plagues in his career, but this was different. There was something strange about the disease that had overtaken her, something that went beyond just the physical decay. His medical scanners beeped in soft, irregular intervals, displaying readings that baffled him. This illness, if it could even be called that, didn't behave like anything he had ever encountered. It didn't fit into any of the familiar diagnostic categories, nor did it respond to the typical treatments he was accustomed to using. The more Eli worked, the more he began to feel the weight of her condition, not just physically but emotionally. This wasn't just a medical case, it was a tragedy, a fall from grace. The once glorious Queen of the Thornback Nebula had been abandoned, left to suffer alone by the very people who had once revered her. Her advisors, her ministers, her people, all had turned their backs on her. Eli couldn't shake the thought. Why? What had driven them to such drastic actions? As he worked, he remembered the warning from LC, his assistant AI, before they had landed on Kryla. This could be political, not medical. There's something more going on here, and you could be stepping into a firestorm. Eli had brushed it off at the time. But now, standing in the Queen's chamber, he wondered if LC had been right. There was more to this story than just an illness. The way the palace had been abandoned, the fear in the eyes of the guards, the cold indifference of those who had once sworn their loyalty. It all pointed to something deeper, something dark that was hidden behind the Queen's affliction. He gently ran his fingers over Alyssa's hand, noticing the sharp contrast between her frail skin and the shimmering, almost ethereal glow that had once defined her. How could such a vibrant and powerful leader fall so far? What had happened to the unity she had forged among the star systems? What had caused her people to turn on her, leaving her to die alone in a gilded cage? Eli sighed and glanced over at the data on his screen. The medical readings were inconclusive, and the scanners were unable to identify any known pathogen or illness. It was almost as if Alyssa's body was rejecting itself, as though the very essence of her had been corrupted by something beyond simple disease. The Queen's body seemed to be under attack from within, and whatever it was spreading at an alarming rate. His frustration mounted. He had been trained to handle the most complex and severe cases, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He knew there had to be more to it. There had to be some explanation for the rapid decline of one of the galaxy's most powerful and revered leaders. But as he worked, he also realized that finding answers would not be as simple as diagnosing a medical condition. This would require more than just medical expertise. It would require understanding the politics, the alliances, and the betrayals that had shaped the Queen's life. As the hours passed, Eli found himself growing more and more restless. He needed answers, but the palace held no clues. The guards had been tight-lipped, avoiding any direct mention of the events that had led to the Queen's current condition. It was as though everyone in Kryla had been instructed to forget her, to pretend that she never existed. The only thing that remained was the Queen's desperate plea for help, a signal that had traveled across the galaxy to reach him. Just as Eli was beginning to lose hope, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the guards, the tall one who had spoken earlier. His face was still grim, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes now. Something that wasn't fear. He stepped into the room hesitantly, glancing at Alyssa's prone form before locking eyes with Eli. I'm sorry for the way we've treated you," the guard said, his voice low and uncertain. I know it's not enough, but I wanted to apologize for what happened to her, for what we let happen." Eli paused, unsure of what to say. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of the situation. The guard's sudden appearance was both surprising and welcome, but it only raised more questions. "What do you mean?" Eli asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "What happened here? Why is the queen in this condition? Why did no one help her?" The guard swallowed hard, shifting uneasily as he stepped further into the room. He looked as though he was wrestling with something, as though the weight of guilt was heavy on his shoulders. "You don't know the full story," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The queen's illness, it wasn't just a disease. There was more to it than that. She wasn't just abandoned by her people out of fear. There were political reasons. The disease came, yes, but the fall of the queen wasn't because of that alone." Eli's heart skipped a beat. Political reasons. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. "What do you mean?" Eli pressed. "What political reasons?" The guard hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the doorway, as if to make sure no one was listening. Then, in a hushed tone, he spoke. There were factions within the nebula. Rival factions that didn't want Alyssa's rule to continue. They saw her illness as an opportunity, a way to take her out of power without bloodshed. They started rumors, spread lies about her. They made it seem like she was no longer fit to lead. They turned the people against her, sowed distrust, and left her alone, vulnerable. Those who stayed loyal were silenced, one by one. Eli listened in stunned silence. The queen had been betrayed by those closest to her, manipulated by power-hungry factions within her own empire. What had started as an illness had become a tool for political maneuvering, a weapon used to strip her of everything she had built. The guard continued, his voice barely audible. "We were too afraid to act. Those who tried to speak up, they disappeared. The queen was left to suffer in silence, while the galaxy turned its back on her." Eli's stomach turned as the full scope of the situation unfolded before him. This was no ordinary medical case. This was a story of treachery, manipulation, and political intrigue. Queen Alyssa's affliction was only the beginning of a much darker tale, a story of betrayal that stretched far beyond her own suffering. He glanced down at Alyssa, who lay motionless on the bed, her once vibrant form now a shadow of her former self. The queen had been abandoned by her people, not just because of her illness, but because of the fear and greed of those who saw an opportunity to take her place. Eli's resolve hardened. He was here to help, yes, but he was also here to uncover the truth. And if the galaxy had turned its back on Alyssa, then it was up to him to give her the justice she deserved. "There's more to this than just a cure," Eli said, his voice firm. "I'm not just here to save her life. I'm here to uncover the truth of what happened to her. And I won't rest until I do." The guard nodded, a small flicker of hope in his eyes. For the first time, Eli felt that he was not alone in this fight. They were in this together now. The queen's suffering wasn't just her burden, it was the galaxy's. And together, they would make sure that the truth would be known. The search for truth. The sun was setting over Krila, casting a golden hue across the grand palace as Eli continued his work beside Queen Alyssa's frail form. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever, as though the weight of her suffering hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Eli had seen death before. He had witnessed the tragedies of war and the ravages of disease, but nothing compared to the haunting stillness that now gripped the queen's chambers. Eli's thoughts swirled with questions. How had this once mighty queen fallen so far? How had she gone from a symbol of peace and hope to a broken, abandoned figure, left to suffer in the shadows of her own palace? The guard's confession had revealed something far darker than just a medical crisis. There was treachery at play here, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the queen's illness. As Eli continued his examination of Alyssa, carefully administering various treatments and scans, his mind kept returning to the political motives that had driven her people to turn on her. The factions within the Thornback Nebula, once united under her leadership, had broken apart, each vying for control, each eager to seize power from a queen they had once worshipped. What had begun as a political game had turned into something far more dangerous, a campaign of lies, manipulation, and fear. He paused for a moment and looked down at Alyssa, still unconscious, her once beautiful features now twisted by the disease. Her pulse was weak, but it was still there, a faint heartbeat, the last sign of life in her body. The disease had ravaged her, but her spirit remained unbroken. In the faint glow of the palace's dim lighting, Eli could see the faintest glimmer of something more in her, the strength that had made her a leader, the will to survive. But survival wasn't enough. Eli had made a promise to himself. He was here to do more than just save her life. He was here to uncover the truth. And to do that, he would need answers. He would need to dive deeper into the tangled web of politics and betrayal that had led to Alyssa's downfall. The palace itself held secrets, secrets that only the brave or the foolish would dare uncover. The guard, who had provided the first clues about the palace's internal strife, had disappeared after their conversation. Eli couldn't help but wonder if the man had said all he knew or if there was more to the story that was yet to be revealed. For all the guard's guilt, there was something in his eyes that told Eli the truth was still hidden, buried beneath layers of fear and silence. Eli had been in the nebula long enough to understand how things worked here. He knew how power was wielded with subtlety and precision, how alliances could be forged and shattered in the blink of an eye. But the political maneuvering within the Thornback Nebula was unlike anything Eli had ever witnessed. The queen had been loved by so many, respected by so many, and yet her own people had turned on her so easily. What had changed? Who had been behind it all? He couldn't ignore the possibility that the answer lay within the palace itself. There had to be records, hidden documents, something that could shed light on the dark forces at play. But where to begin? The palace was vast, its halls and chambers endless, filled with the opulence of a once great empire. The golden walls that had witnessed countless victories and celebrations now felt like a tomb, a place where memories had been buried, erased by those who wished to erase the queen's legacy. Eli stood up, his mind racing. The queen's life was in his hands, but her legacy, the truth of what had happened to her, was something that needed to be uncovered. It wasn't just for her, it was for the galaxy, for the people who had once looked to her for guidance. They deserved to know what had happened to their queen. After a moment of deep reflection, Eli made up his mind. He had to explore the palace further. He had to find the hidden truths that others had gone to great lengths to bury. The palace was filled with secrets, and Eli had no intention of leaving until he had unearthed them. Eli knew the risks. The factions that had conspired against Alyssa were powerful, and they would do anything to keep their actions hidden. But Eli had faced danger before, and this was a cause worth fighting for. If the queen had been betrayed, then the galaxy had to know the full story. He walked out of the queen's chambers, his mind set on finding answers. The guards who had been standing outside, silent as ever, watched him intently but said nothing. They had been complicit in the queen's isolation, turning a blind eye to her suffering. Now, Eli would find out just how deep their involvement went. As he made his way down the long hallways, Eli's eyes scanned the ornate surroundings, taking in every detail. The palace was beautiful, no doubt, but its beauty felt hollow now, like a shell of what it had once been. The once pristine marble floors were chipped and cracked, the gilded tapestries that hung along the walls faded from years of neglect. Even the air felt thick with dust, as though the palace itself had given up hope. Eli stopped in front of a grand set of double doors, their edges gilded with the same golden sheen that adorned the rest of the palace. Behind these doors, he knew, lay the queen's private archives, a place where records were kept, where history was written. The archives had been a central part of Alyssa's rule, where important treaties were documented and key decisions were made. If there were any records that could explain what had happened to her, they would be here. With a deep breath, Eli pushed open the doors. The room beyond was vast and lined with shelves filled with ancient scrolls and data cubes, each one a testament to the Queen's reign. There were records of alliances, declarations of peace, and stories of triumph. Yet, as Eli scanned the room, his eyes landed on something different. In the far corner of the room, hidden behind a stack of old data files, was a small compartment, its surface worn and scratched with age. Eli approached cautiously, his heart pounding. What could be hidden here? What had been concealed for so long? He pried open the compartment, revealing a small sealed datapad. The device was old, its surface cracked and dusty, but the seal was still intact. He had no doubt that this was something important, something that had been hidden away from prying eyes. As he activated the datapad, a faint glow illuminated the dim room, casting an eerie light across the walls. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single message, written in the Queen's own hand. It was brief, yet the words sent a chill down Eli's spine. To those who will come after me, beware. The disease that afflicts me is not just a curse of the body. It is a curse of the soul. They think I have fallen, but I know the truth. The disease is not my undoing. Betrayal is. They will stop at nothing to erase me, to take what I have built. But they will fail. The truth will live on. The truth will survive. The message ended abruptly, as though the Queen had been interrupted before she could finish her thoughts. Eli stood frozen, the weight of her words crashing over him. Betrayal. The Queen had known. She had known all along that the disease wasn't the cause of her downfall. It was the people she had trusted who had brought her to this point. This datapad, hidden away in the deepest corners of the palace, was the key to unraveling the conspiracy that had torn the Thornback Nebula apart. Eli knew one thing for certain now. His mission was not just about saving the Queen. It was about revealing the truth to the galaxy, exposing the forces that had betrayed her, and bringing them to justice. With renewed determination, Eli tucked the datapad into his jacket and made his way back to Alyssa's chambers. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But the path ahead would be fraught with danger. Those who had conspired against her would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But Eli was no stranger to danger. This fight was far from over. A dangerous game. The night had fallen over Krila, casting the palace in shadows as Eli made his way back to Queen Alyssa's chambers. The weight of the hidden message burned in his pocket like a silent reminder of the treachery that had taken place within these walls. He could not afford to rest, not now. He had uncovered a vital piece of the puzzle, a piece that could reveal the full extent of the betrayal, but the path forward was fraught with peril. Eli had expected resistance. In fact, he had anticipated it. The factions that had conspired against Alyssa's rule were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to keep their actions concealed. But what he had found in the archives had confirmed his fears. The disease that had ravaged Alyssa's body was not the cause of her downfall. It was merely the cover for something much darker, something far more deliberate. Someone had orchestrated her downfall, and the disease had been the weapon used to discredit her, to make her seem weak and unfit to rule. Eli's mind raced as he walked the empty halls of the palace, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Every corner he turned, every doorway he passed, felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. There were eyes everywhere in this place, hidden, unseen, but always watching. He couldn't afford to be discovered, not yet. Not before he had the full story. As he reached the Queen's chambers, Eli felt the familiar tension building in his chest. The door, once ornate and inviting, now felt like an impenetrable fortress, guarding the last vestiges of a once great ruler's life. He had been in and out of these chambers countless times already, but tonight, something felt different. The air was thicker, charged with an unspoken threat. Inside, Alyssa still lay motionless, her condition unchanged. The flickering lights above cast long shadows across her fragile form, her skin pale and cracked like porcelain. Her once immaculate beauty was now little more than a memory, but Eli could still sense the strength beneath her physical decline. He had seen many patients give up, but something in Alyssa refused to succumb. She was a fighter, a leader, even in her weakened state. Eli approached her slowly, gently adjusting the monitoring devices he had set up earlier. He needed to understand more. If the disease wasn't the cause of her suffering, then what was? What had been done to her? Every instinct told him there was more to this story, more than the scattered fragments of truth he had unearthed so far. But before he could dig any deeper, the door to the chamber creaked open behind him. He spun around quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his waist. His pulse quickened, but the figure that stepped into the room made him pause. It was the guard, the one who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had first hinted at the betrayal that had taken place within the palace. "Dr. Ramsey," the guard said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to speak with you. It's not safe for you to be here." Eli's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "What are you doing here?" I thought you'd be staying away." The guard's eyes darted nervously around the room, and he stepped further inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "I came to warn you," he said, his tone tense. "You're not the only one looking for answers. There are others in the palace who have started to realize you've been asking questions. People who want to make sure the truth stays buried." Eli narrowed his eyes. "Who?" The guard hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were struggling with whether or not to speak. Finally, he whispered, "The High Council, the ones who abandoned the Queen. They're not just politicians. They're dangerous. They've already set their plans in motion, and if they find out you're digging into things they want left alone, they'll stop at nothing to silence you." Eli's mind raced. The High Council, the very people who had once been Alyssa's closest allies, her most trusted advisors. They were the ones who had withdrawn their support, who had abandoned her in her greatest time of need. And now, they were orchestrating her downfall. "You're saying they're behind all of this?" Eli asked, his voice rising with urgency. "They caused the Queen's illness. They're the ones who turned her people against her." The guard nodded grimly, not directly. "The disease, it wasn't their doing, but everything that happened after, that was them. They saw the Queen as a threat. She was too powerful, too loved. They saw it as their chance to take control." Eli's chest tightened with frustration. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. The Queen had been brought down not by the disease, but by the people she had trusted most. The ones who had once sworn loyalty to her were the very ones who had cast her aside, not out of fear of her affliction, but because they had seen an opportunity to seize power. "I can't just sit here and let this happen," Eli said, his voice low and resolute. "I'm not leaving until I uncover the truth, until I make sure Alyssa's name is cleared." The guard looked around nervously again, his face a mixture of fear and guilt. "You don't understand," he said, lowering his voice even further. "The High Council is already making their move. They've already begun to spread rumors about you, about your presence here. They'll have the palace on lockdown soon. If they find you, if they find out you're the one who's been asking questions, it will be too late." Eli's mind raced. He could feel the pressure mounting. Time was running out, and if he didn't act quickly, everything he had uncovered could be lost forever. The Queen's life, her legacy, the truth, it all hung in the balance. "You said they're spreading rumors," Eli said, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of rumors?" The guard hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "They're saying you're here on a mission from the Federation, that you're trying to exploit the Queen's illness for your own gain. They've already made you a target, Eli. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure you disappear." Eli's heart sank. The High Council had begun their counterattack. framing him as the villain in a story where he was simply trying to save a life. If they succeeded in their narrative, everything he had worked for would be destroyed, and Alyssa's suffering would be swept under the rug. "I need to speak to her," Eli said, his voice firm. "I need to find out what she knows. She's the only one who can help me piece this together." The guard nodded reluctantly. "I'll help you, but we need to be careful. The palace isn't safe anymore. You've got to act quickly." Eli took a deep breath, his mind already racing through the possibilities. His mission had just become far more complicated, but he couldn't back down now. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. "Let's move," Eli said, his voice steady. "We don't have much time." With a final glance at Alyssa, he turned and followed the guard, knowing that the next phase of his quest would be the most dangerous yet. The High Council was already in motion, but Eli had something they didn't: the truth. And he would stop at nothing to ensure it came to light. The hidden war. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the guard through the labyrinthine hallways of the palace. Every step he took felt like a deliberate move through a minefield, each footfall heavier than the last. The palace, with its gilded walls and ornate decor, once a symbol of power and prosperity, now felt like a cage. A gilded cage meant to trap truth and keep it hidden. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, seemed to hold a secret, a whisper of betrayal. The High Council, the very people who had once sworn to protect Queen Alyssa, were now hunting him, doing everything they could to ensure the Queen's suffering remained a quiet, forgotten thing. The guard, whose name Eli had yet to learn, led him to a narrow side passage. He moved quickly, his footsteps almost silent against the marble floors. The air was thick with tension, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they rounded a corner, the guard paused and motioned for Eli to stop. "Here," the guard whispered, pressing his back against the stone wall and peering down the corridor. "The counselors have their meeting chambers just beyond this door. I need to warn you. There are those who have already seen your presence as a threat. If they find out you're looking for more answers, they'll stop at nothing." Eli's gaze fixed on the door the guard had pointed to, his mind turning over the possibilities. The High Council wasn't just a political body. It was the beating heart of power in the Thornback Nebula, controlling the galaxy's delicate balance. With their power and influence, they could easily erase anyone who stood in their way. And here he was, standing on the precipice, uncovering something no one had been willing to confront. He knew the danger, but he couldn't back down now. "What do we do?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get to the records," the guard replied urgently. "The council's records are hidden in a private chamber beneath the palace, where no one can easily access them. But getting there won't be easy. It's locked behind layers of security, and the path there is carefully guarded." Eli's stomach churned. Layers of security meant layers of danger. His mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. He couldn't go back to the Queen empty-handed. Not after everything he had uncovered. But getting into the council's private chamber wasn't going to be simple. It would require more than just brute force. It would require strategy, precision, and perhaps a little luck. The guard seemed to read his thoughts. "I know where to start," he said, his voice low but steady. "There's a control room hidden within the palace. It controls the palace's surveillance systems and some of the security measures. I can disable the cameras and the security grid long enough for you to get into the records." Eli nodded. "Lead the way." The guard turned sharply, leading him down another series of narrow, dimly lit corridors. They passed through old servant quarters, now unused, the faded remnants of what was once a bustling palace. The further they went, the more the atmosphere changed, becoming heavier, more suffocating. It felt like they were descending deeper into the heart of the palace's darkness, and with each step, Eli felt the weight of the conspiracy bearing down on him. After what felt like an eternity of winding through the palace's forgotten halls, the guard stopped before an unassuming door. It was made of simple wood, its surface worn with age. The guard pressed his palm against a small panel beside the door, and with a faint hum, the door slid open. Inside was a small control room, the walls lined with monitors and consoles. A lone chair sat in the middle, and a terminal blinked with soft green lights. The guard moved quickly, seating himself at the terminal and typing in a series of commands. Eli kept his eyes on the door, his senses alert. The minutes seemed to stretch out forever as the guard worked, his hands flying over the keys with practiced speed. "There," the guard muttered. "I've disabled the surveillance cameras and bypassed the security protocols for the next few hours. You've got a window of time, Eli. Make it count." Eli nodded, his heart racing. He didn't waste another second. Without another word, he turned and headed back toward the palace's core, where the council's records were hidden. The path was dark, but Eli felt his resolve harden with each step. He was getting closer. The closer he got to the truth, the more it seemed like the walls of the palace were closing in on him, as if the very structure of the place was conspiring to keep its secrets safe. As they neared the entrance to the council's private chambers, the guard's voice stopped him. "Be careful," he warned. "You're not just up against the council. There are others, loyalists, spies, who will do anything to protect the truth from getting out. They won't hesitate to silence you if they know what you're after." Eli's eyes narrowed. The gravity of the situation had hit him with full force. This wasn't just about saving the queen. It was about bringing down the system that had allowed corruption to fester unchecked. It was about uncovering the rot that lay beneath the polished surface of the palace, beneath the smiling faces of the counselors. And Eli was the one who had to pull it all into the light. He pushed the door open to the secret chamber. The room beyond was vast and cold, its walls lined with shelves filled with scrolls, datapads, and old records. The air smelled musty, the remnants of history long since buried in the dust. But there was no time to waste. Eli moved quickly, searching for anything that might hold the key to the conspiracy against Alyssa. He found it almost by accident, buried deep within a stack of old datapads. It was a record, a hidden message, encoded with a security system designed to keep it from prying eyes. As Eli plugged the device into the console beside him, the screen flickered to life, revealing a series of encrypted files. His hands trembled as he scrolled through them, his eyes wide in shock at what he was uncovering. There on the screen was the truth. The High Council had orchestrated Alyssa's downfall from the very beginning. They had known about her illness long before the public had, and they had used it as a tool to manipulate the people. They had spread rumors, whispered lies, and planted seeds of doubt, all while working behind the scenes to seize control of the nebula. The disease that had ravaged Alyssa's body had been a convenient excuse, a way to push her from power without triggering a rebellion. But the most damning part of the record was the revelation of who had been behind it all. It wasn't just the counselors. It was a shadowy cable of high-ranking officials, military leaders, and even a few former allies who had once pledged their loyalty to Alyssa. They had conspired to discredit her, to turn her from a hero into a villain in the eyes of the people. And when they were done, they planned to erase her memory completely. Eli's breath caught in his throat. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. The conspiracy wasn't just political. It was personal, and it was far-reaching. If he didn't act now, the truth might never see the light of day. The Queen's life, the galaxy's future, everything hinged on this moment. He quickly downloaded the files, slipping the datapad into his jacket before turning back to the guard. "We've got what we need," Eli said, his voice resolute. "Let's go." But as he reached for the door, a sound, footsteps, echoed from the hall. The guard's face paled. "They're here," he whispered. Eli's heart raced. The clock was ticking. He had what he came for, but getting out of the palace alive was another challenge entirely. The fight for the truth had just begun.